right, Coach, we've reached chapter 8, leadership and culture. And if I had to say, what was probably the most important part of mastering off-season football, the development of leadership and culture is probably top of the list, in my opinion. For someone who's been around, various programs at different levels as a player and a coach, I can tell you that teams with great culture tend to be very successful, and teams with horrible culture tend to waste talent and underachieve. And I think that's really, really important. And I think one of the things that the internet and things like courses like this have done over the last maybe 10 years have really provided coaches with the opportunity to learn culture and understand that you can teach it and grow it and build it. As someone who has a master's in school administration, I can tell you that when I was doing those programs, 90% of that stuff, every course talked about school culture, school climate, and that's why back in the days you'd always see, the old football coach will retire and become the principal because those guys were masters of culture. And if you ever go to a school building and everybody's happy and people are just, excited to be there every day and it's just a great place to work, usually the scores are good, the kids are well behaved, the teachers are happy. It's a culture thing. I mean, you can just feel it when you walk in the building. Football programs are no different. Talent alone can't win games. Culture wins games. So there's kind of two parts to that. You're kind of your leadership council, and then the biggest piece is accountability, and that's kind of where you get to where you're in a good place is when your players are holding each other accountable. And just remember, the goal is to go from a coach led program to a player led program, and that's super super important. Teammates holding teammates accountable is more powerful than coach discipline. Your leadership council has to have real responsibilities. Like what are you guys doing? I mean, help set up practice schedules for the summertime, where you're going to 7-on-7, where you want to go to camp. Let your kids, be parts of that. Even little things like what combination of uniforms they wear, those kind of things. Every player needs to have an accountability partner. Hey man, I saw you didn't do well, or you've missed a couple of days of class, so and so here, or what's going on? I haven't seen you at workouts the last couple of days, dude. What's up with that? That's how you build championship culture. Um, and it's a thing where your consequences and everything need to be player driven. And if you get to that point, you're going to find yourself ahead of a well driven bus. If you've ever, read that book, The Energy Bus, it talks about getting the right people on the bus. Anybody can drive a bus, but successful coaches and leaders, whether it's in business or sports, or people who put the right people on the bus. And that's just kind of a thing. And you don't want, everything to be about a mandate of culture, of coaches. Also culture is about daily behavior, man. I mean, it's not about just having a poster on a wall or, team me t-shirts and all those great things that we spend money on. It's really about, what you expect. I mean, if practice is supposed to start at 3:45, it's got to start at 3:45. If we don't wear slides in the weight room, we don't wear slides in the weight room. Things have to be, put in place, and those things have to be acted on every day, and it just establishes that culture, establishes that discipline. One of my favorite Bobby Bowden quotes back in the day, he would say things like, that what you allow, you encourage. And so as you're building your culture, you have to be very intentional about what's important. You have to define your specific behaviors that demonstrate your values. So, if you want to be a tough football team, you have to define what toughness is. And that means, hey, we're going to finish every drill. We're never going to complain about conditioning. And if somebody's hurt, we're going to keep them in the fold. That's what toughness is about. Because, when times get hard, man, you want to know who you can count on. And that's built in the weight room. That's built in the off season. And so you have to be able to have specific behaviors that demonstrate what each one of your values are. And I think that's really, really important. Also, as you're developing your leaders, Identify those guys early. Pay attention to who your JV guys flock to, and sometimes it's not always the best player. It's just that guy that's got that charisma, and those are the ones that you want to have be mentored by your great players, your great leaders that are in your program. You want to develop your leadership programs, and I'm gonna move over and show you some of the materials that we have talking about leadership and accountability, and kind of the 4 week cycle class that we talk about in the book. But we want to develop communication skills. We want to develop conflict resolution. We want to develop decision making under pressure. We want to rotate leadership responsibilities. We don't want the same person. We want the same person to be in charge of everything. Because what happens if that person is removed from the situation? Whether it's through injury or moving away or graduation. We want guys who've been experienced in a lot of different areas. So let's jump over here, and I'm going to show you kind of the outline of the leadership and accountability portion of the course. So looking over here, here's kind of the coach's instructional overview. Kind of tells you how you're supposed to implement these kind of things. I know working with Coach Salas, he was a big Brian Kane guy. If you've ever, have you ever studied those kind of things? Brian Kane has a really good system. He was a baseball guy, and his stuff was really good. And we did that when we worked together at Hopton all those years ago. Another good resource is the Randy Jackson books. If you haven't read those are great books to read and reread if you're dealing with building culture and you really want to turn a program around. That's the quickest way to turn programs around. It's not about being stronger in the weight room, changing offenses. If you can just change the culture, um, and the biggest thing when you take over a losing program is you say all the right things, so on and so forth, but if you can get kids to not dip their head the first time something bad happens, you're making progress. And that's culture. And those are things you got to work on in the off season. So you look at this leadership and accountability program. It's a 4 week leadership cycle that repeats every month. It's develops player driven leaderships, accountability, communication, and football IQ. And once again, the goal is to shift from a coach led program to a player led program. And I'm not going to sit here and read it all for you, but basically each cycle has four themes. Week one is self awareness and core values. Who they are. Your people are going to fill out these worksheets. Who are they as leaders? Reflect on the team core values. What those core values mean. Whether it be faith, family, football. We all have those lists. What are the strengths and weaknesses and personal habits? And then your job as a coach is to facilitate the accountability partner pairings, or review completed worksheets. I mean, dude, don't just give them paper and not look at it and respond. I mean, all you got to do is go to a math class, right? If you go to a math class and the teacher gives homework or classwork or whatever, and then the next day she just walks through and just checks, oh yeah, okay. She doesn't check to see if it's right. She just checks it. The first couple of days, the kids are really going to bust their hind parts to make sure they're doing it right. And then when they realize that she's not really giving authentic feedback, she's just kind of checking a box, then they just start scribbling or using the cell phone to have them do all the math problems. Or if you give a kid a test and you don't give the kid the grade back for 2 weeks, there's no immediate feedback. And so it's like it's useless to them. Coaching is teaching. And if you're a great coach, you can be a great teacher. It's just about being intentional and putting that effort in. The same thing with this stuff. If you want this to work, you got to follow these things. You want to reinforce these core values in meetings and practices. Cycle two, week two is communication and team influence. What are your communication habits? What are your peer interactions? Huddle and sideline, leaderships. Even that has a dynamic. Who talks? Where are your eyes? How the things. I've always been a big fan of everybody. I like the circle huddle, not the old school 2 line huddle. I like the one where the quarterback comes in at the side and everybody can see everybody's face. I think that's really, really important to me. I mean, that's a little thing, but that's just me, and we don't do that where I'm at now. I mean, I'm not the head coach, so I mean, but it's just something that I like to do because I like for everybody to have that sense of accountability of I can look in that guy's eyes across from me and know he's ready to do the deal. So you want to model your communication standards, provide daily feedback on player presence and tone. I'm huge on body language. And I've pulled the kid to the side. I'm like, dude, man, your body language is not well right now. It's just it's saying all the wrong things, and I need you to fix that because people see your body language and they're making a decision about who you are as a person. Body language, I think, is really really important. Big Brian Kane thing is the idea of self talk. How do you talk to yourself? Hey, dude, I know you just messed up, but I need you to fix that. I was on the golf course today with my cousin and his buddy, and his buddy was having a back nine that was just horrible. He didn't play well at all. I mean, we're all duffers to be fair. I mean, I broke 100 today, and I felt like I won the Super Bowl, but I had to pull him to the side after hole 16, and I was like, look, man, we played 17 last weekend, and you hit that thing within 10 feet of the pin. It was a par three. I said, you got that in your locker. I need you to put this last hole, couple of holes behind you, and go up there and don't beat yourself up and just say, hey, look, man, those I can't do nothing about that, but let's move forward. And I'd love to say that he went in there and hit it 10 feet from the pin, but he kind of crumbled, and he kind of crumbled a little bit. And we talked about it after we got done. He's like, man, I just got myself in a situation. I was like, well, dude, your self-talk. I said, you're turning me into a coach right now. He wasn't an athlete for me or anything like that, but he was a little bit younger guy. And we talked about, how you talk to yourself. I'm gonna make good plays, that positive environment. But that's a communication standard. Um, Encouraging leadership and drills and things of that nature. And we talked about rotating, leadership responsibilities, and all these things are intentional. And I keep using that word intentional, but as you're designing your off season and you're learning to master the off season, you have to know that intentionality is so important. Week 3 being that situational leadership and football IQ. This is where we're really focusing on um, certain scenarios in football, how we respond to them, what's important, teaching them how to study film. I think is cool. A lot of this stuff isn't just, hey, we're going to get better at pulling, or we're going to get better at releases, or we're going to get better at drops, et cetera, et cetera. It's, hey, look, this is a film. This is a scenario. You tell me what you saw in this film, and I'm going to tell you what you should have seen. Doing those kind of things, meeting with coaches, evaluations. Um, you're going to look at those scenario sheets, and obviously, and look, and here's the thing: involve your assistants in this. Okay, one of the things that I've been fortunate of is, I was a head football coach for 12 or 13 years. I can't even remember how it is, but I've had I think it's a dozen now of my assistants who have become varsity head football coaches. And a lot of that, a lot of that was in spite of me, to be fair. I mean, that's not really true. I mean, I did a lot in empowering my young guys, especially, and trying to teach them the right way to do things. But those guys have gone on to be very, very successful. But that happens because you teach them, hey, this is how we do this. This is how we do that. This is what you do on these kind of things. And you give them responsibilities. And hey, you want to be a head coach one day? Well, this is what it takes. I need you to take your group and lead your group. I need you to be the head coach of your group. And as you give those younger guys responsibilities and things like that, when they get their chance, they're gonna fly. And so your job as a head football coach is to grow coaches, and your coach's job is to grow players. So let them grow players. You'll see, and that's a good way. And we'll get into staff management and stuff here in a little bit, but you'll see that shows kind of what talents your assistants have. And as you're growing them, you can say, hey, well, look, man, you got to work on giving your kids better feedback. And then week 4 is reflection, evaluation, and goal reset. You want to meet with those kids, talk to them. Hey, look, how's this going? Hey, look, I saw your drill tapes that you sent me in, because remember we were talking about player development, and or why haven't you sent me any drill tapes? What's going on? Why haven't you been working? Those kind of things, and then it gives you kind of an implementation guide, kind of ideas of time and things of that nature. How to some ideas about how to use the accountability partners, the worksheets, and all that stuff. And like I said, have a leader of the week, those kind of things, shout outs. And then it kind of gives you the deal. And so here's, and then all the worksheets are in there as well, kind of what they're supposed to fill out, and all those kind of things. So that's kind of a cool thing. Leadership is so cool. I think if you want to be an effective leader, whether it's as a head football coach in business or anything like that, You got to study culture. You got to study developing leadership and understand that if you throw into this part of your off season, I'm telling you, you will see the biggest difference because guys who are in a strong cultural situation where everybody has, kind of the same direction, everybody has the same ideas of what's right, what's wrong, will tend to be more productive and effective. So moving forward, study those things. Look at the Randy Jackson stuff. Look at Brian Kane. Google a bunch of other guys. There's tons and tons and tons. And then take a little bit of everything and adapt it. These are just kind of generalized ways of doing things. Research your things and figure out what works best for you to build leadership and culture. All right, Coach. Here we are in Chapter 9. We're going to talk about staff and program management as we're mastering the offseason of football. There's a lot of flux in staff during the off season, obviously, especially, at the upper levels. But, at high school, most of your staff kind of goes in 18 different directions. Guys are coaching other sports and things of that nature, usually, especially at the smaller schools. So it's really hard to get your staff together quite a bit in the off season. So, depending on your situation, you have to figure it out. But generally speaking, having a monthly staff meeting, is pretty cool. Even if you have to do it in the mornings before school, get you some biscuits, bring it in, have everybody come in and just kind of have a conversation about what's going on within the program, and I think that's really really important. Defining roles is so important on a staff. Let guys know what they're in charge of, what they're not in charge of, what their administrative tasks are. If you're doing leadership and accountability programs like we talked about earlier in the course, getting a report from your guys and seeing which players are checking in and which players aren't. Reviewing guys who are making big strides and guys who maybe are sinking and not swimming as well as they should. These are all things that you can talk about when you get your guys together. I talked about earlier on in Chapter 1, having that debrief with your staff and kind of figuring out, hey, who wants to come back, who's maybe looking at other avenues, who wants a different role, who maybe wants to be promoted to being a coordinator or doing those kind of things. And this is where, you've kind of set these things in motion with your coaches as far as, hey, this is what you need to do. These are the things that I need to see. These are the clinics that we're going to, those kind of things, and kind of gauge where your staff is. Having those open channels of communication are just really, really important. I mean, we have a group chat and it goes around, year round. I mean, and this time of year it's memes and Instagrams, picking on guys who whose team lost. We got a guy who's a big Alabama fan, and whenever Alabama loses, we always kill him with stuff, and vice versa. But just having that camaraderie, with your group is really really important. But if in the off season in particular, having a monthly staff meeting or biweekly staff meeting to find out where things are going and those kind of things. And once again, I'm gonna use that word that I've been using a lot in the course, is that being intentional. Let the staff meetings have a purpose. Don't just meet to have a meeting and something that could have been an email or a text, but hey, listen, guys, I need you guys to come in. We need to talk about what's going on with so and so. This is what's going on academically. This is what's going on, so on and so forth, and how those guys respond to those. Those things kind of gives you an idea of who's in and who's out. But having those communication channels are really really important. Growing your staff. I mentioned earlier I've had a bunch of guys go on to become head coaches. And one of the things that I always told them, as a young coach, is, be excellent in the classroom. Don't give yourself headaches during the school day that you can avoid. The principal pays you way more than the AD does, unless you work in Texas or Georgia or one of those places. But do your job during the school day and make that be an important thing. uh, talk about clinics, expect those guys to come if they can, and try to plan them around other sports. I mean, a lot of the big clinics, D1 clinics and stuff, they always happen. And, there's always, for us, it was always wrestling regionals or a basketball playoff game or something. So everybody couldn't come, but try to get everybody together as much as possible. Have a learning environment. And a lot of times, and when you clinic, go clinic. I mean, I remember back in the day, we would go to clinics and, we'd show up and, my rule was you can go out and have a good time and do all the things you want to do, but you're going to be in your position meeting. So if you're a D-line coach and the D-line meeting is at 8:00, hey man, dude, don't stay out to 2:00 drinking and doing everything and then not make your meeting. That's the most important thing. Remember why we're here. Have a good time. And my other thing is I want you to meet 3 new people at every clinic. Don't just come up there and hang out with us. Go meet other people. Branch out. Build your network. And I always thought that was really, really important as far as mentoring young coaches and growing your staff, and I think that's super super important when you're doing those kind of things. And then how are you handling logistics? One of the things that I was very appreciative of as a young assistant was my head coach took me to the equipment shows. He taught me about, reconditioning and all these kind of things very, very early on. And so, I was 26 when I got my first head coaching job. And, I knew the management and the logistic piece because I had done it for 3 years. It was the people piece and some of the other stuff that you learn when you become a head coach that I had a hard time with early on. But those kind of things, I was very, very fortunate that my head coach had taught me those kind of things. And I think that's really, really important. So, those the three kind of things that were most important, clarity and roles for your staff, having kind of a communication protocol of how things go on, when the meetings are, put them on a calendar, don't change them, at the last minute, respect guys' time and those kind of things like that. And then invest in staff development, take them to clinics, get them a budget for coach tube courses if possible, buy them as a staff and share them, however you guys do it. But, continually try to grow your coaches during the off season, hold them accountable, make them a part of everything. And that's kind of what we talked about. We've been talking about, the leadership. Have the assistants have their group. You can't do it all by yourself as the head football coach. It's just too big if you want to do it right. If you're trying to build a culture of success and you want to master this thing, it's a group thing. And I promise you, if you guys attack the off season as a group, when it's in season, it's so much fun. And I've been to so many places, and it's been me myself before. My guys have just been so busy doing everything else that I was managing academics after, I was doing academics, I was doing recruiting, I was doing, equipment, I was doing everything in the off season that they needed to be done because my guys were just, they were out there doing other stuff. And it wasn't that they didn't care, but their role, they had different roles. Some of my assistants were heads in other sports and so on and so forth. So, being able to get your guys together at least once a month, sit down, have a chit chat, whether it's at 7:30 in the morning over some sausage biscuits or whatever, I think is really, really important. Getting updates on player development, who's sending videos, who's not sending videos, who's completing workouts, who's not completing workouts, I think is really, really huge. And then managing your staff goes back to what we talked about very, very early. Who wants to be a head coach, who wants a different role, who wants an expanded role, who maybe wants a decreased role. Have a plan for incorporating new coaches. Constantly guys, some places are recycling coaches left and right. Especially if you're in a situation where it's really, really hard to get coaches in the building, which, it's ideal, obviously, but a lot of places, lay coaches are the thing. And what can you do to keep those guys around and keep that cycle from continuously changing over and over and over, because consistency, I think, is what we've talked about. Consistency, accountability, being intentional about everything you're doing are kind of the 3 keys to mastering the off season. And it's no different in when it comes to staff management. And I think that's really cool. even down to things that I used to micromanage. I hate that word, but I would micromanage. I would tell my coaches where I wanted them to stand during certain drills. Hey, this is what I want you looking at. You correct this, you correct that. You got to teach them where to be, especially with your younger guys. But take that time, and say, hey, this is where I want you to be. I'll give you a great example. When I was a defensive coordinator, I coached the inside linebackers, and during team period, I actually stood behind the scout offense because I wanted to see the eyes of my linebackers. I wanted to see what they were looking at. I wanted to see if their eyes were focused on keys, and I couldn't see that from standing behind the defense, or standing over to the side. So I would get behind the scout offense, and I would watch my guys and look at their eyes and see if they were reading their keys and things like that. And those are things that you have to teach your assistants that you want done, whether in pat and go. And it's the same thing on Friday nights, you're looking at this, you're looking at that. These are the things that I need you to key on. I don't need you just standing on the sideline, walking up and down, looking important. Who did that? And if I ask a question, I need to know, okay, hey, what did the outside backers do? Whatever, offensive coach was assigned to the outside backers, he needs to be able to tell me. And if he's not doing his job. We're coaching, we're not watching. And these are roles that you have to clarify for your coaches, what those expectations are. How you're going to break up things like film study, off-season film study, whether if somebody's in charge of recruiting, those kind of things. A lot of young guys are really into this recruiting thing. And then something else that's huge right now, and then if you're really smart with it, is the social media. And I would suggest that you get with like your yearbook people at school and some other people that do those kind of things and say, hey, you got any kids who might want to intern and help us with this, who could help you design those things, and you view them and then you shoot them out, because a lot of people are using the Instagrams and the Twitters and all that stuff to get information out to the community, and that's very, very important. So these are kind of things that you want to do. So obviously, once again, just kind of communication protocols, clarity of roles, investing in staff development, and being intentional about your meetings and trying to get together to keep this process. Because like I said, all this stuff sounds good, but the follow through is important, and you got to have buy-in, and that starts with your staff. All right, Coach, we're coming to the end of the course, chapter 10, where we're going to talk about measuring success and kind of wrapping up the course. Hopefully, you've gained some thoughtful insight as we've gone through this kind of process of mastering the off season, and me sharing some things that I've learned over the years. So there's kind of three kind of really big parts to this thing. The first is the KIPPIS, or what we call the key performance indicators. This is really important. We've been talking about this the whole course. Having being able to make data driven decisions, and having different things that you can look at to show the kids their gains, not only in the weight room but academically, through film study and different things like that. So tracking those tangible metrics, being able to look at different things, is something as little as, attendance in the weight room, giving and assigning, a score for that. I think that's important, because it all comes down to, when that mama comes in your office and wants to know why Johnny isn't playing, and you can just put all this stuff in front of her and say, hey, look, these were all the things that we tried to do. Your son just didn't buy in. Or why did, Johnny, who was an average JV player, all of a sudden become an all conference level varsity player? And you can say, well, shoot, man, he's all in. Look what he did in the weight room. Look what he did in the classroom. Look what he did in individual drill performance. Look at his videos that he created. He was all in. He wanted to be great. Your evaluation cycles, we talked about monthly, quarterly, weekly evaluations, whether it's in your leadership and accountability program, whether it's in your weight room, whether it's in your, individual workouts that they're doing at off season, and filming and sending to the assistant coaches, and having those feedback loops for getting results to and from the kids to the coaches, and the coaches giving them immediate feedback so that they can understand whether they're doing things right, wrong, when they can't be directly supervised in a coaching situation. But letting them know that that individual work is not going unnoticed, I think, is really, really important. And then that idea of legacy, sustaining excellence by building character. We talked about this in one of the chapters of having kind of a revolving door. As one group leaves, the next group takes over, and that's by building, start building leadership and culture from the very beginning. I think is really, really important. And so, as we're building it all, bringing it all together, and looking at building this championship program by mastering the off season. We've talked about creating a vision, and we're trying to create a total system where every piece, the strength, the skill, the scheme, the culture, the leadership, and the management all works in harmony, and everything is done intentionally. I think that's super, super important. You have to be able to identify your program's identity. What's your philosophy? What does your program stand for? It's are you making boys into men, and creating winners for life, or those kind of things. What's your style of offense, defense, special teams? Is it aligned with your players' strength? What's your culture, effort, discipline, accountability? What are your leadership standards? What are your goals, from short-term goals to long-term goals, whether it's wins or program growth? These are things that you have to come up with, and really sit down with, and say, okay, this is what's important. Your off season has to be unified, and I think we've talked about that during this course, how everything has a cycle, and those cycles overlap. It's not just lifting this time and then we're not done lifting. While leadership is going on, lifting is going on. So you're doing your strength and conditioning, you're doing your skill development and position training, whether it's individually, with your accountability partner filming and sending it in to the assistants, or whether it's in a group setting when you have your spring workouts. You're going back and you're refining your system, you're evaluating and simplifying schemes, you're being able to improve how you teach your core concepts. I think that's really big. You're intentionally teaching leadership and culture, to develop your captains. And your captain isn't just your best player. He's got to be that guy that when things go wrong, he can go in the locker room and tighten everything up, and get it right for you. Your leadership council, you're setting your values, your rituals, what your accountability systems are. Your program, how are you training your staff? How are you delegating responsibilities? What is your communication system? What is your succession planning? If one guy leaves, how are you going to replace him? And then one of the things we talked about is how are you integrating new guys into your system? I think that's the time where you have to understand that you have to have an intentional process. Off season is that laboratory, and we talked about this. The game, the first Friday night was won in February. It's not won on the first Friday night in August. It's built well before that first game. Your integration and accountability piece. You want to have players that know their roles, responsibilities, and expectations. Position coaches have to be able to deliver skill mastery, and what are you doing to develop them if they don't have those skills? Because a lot of schools have guys who didn't play football that are coaches, and they have to learn the game, and then they have to learn the techniques. I mean, and two of the greatest college football coaches of all time, Mike Leach and Lou Holtz, didn't play college football. They didn't have to be great players to be amazing coaches. What are you doing to develop coordinators? What are you doing as a head coach to maintain your program's vision, culture, and systems? And that means you have to be intentional. You're not just doing things. You're not just going through the emotions. Everything has to have a purpose. And kids today, if they know there's a purpose, they're okay. You're doing these evaluations. You're consistently giving feedback. That's so important. As you're building this thing, and then you're building this and through all of this, you're really the big thing is you're building this championship mindset. And there's kind of 5 parts to that. You have that process oriented. You're focusing on execution, whether it's in leadership, whether it's in the weight room, whether it's in individual workouts. It's not just about results, it's about how you're doing it. You're trying to build some resiliency, how you handle mistakes. We talked about body language and how important is that. Are you intentionally telling kids about their body language? Players and coaches have a shared ownership of success and failure. So everybody's unified, and you just have to be relentless in your pursuit of success. Never settle for mediocre results. Always strive for improvement. And if you ever find yourself just allowing things to happen, you go back to that Bobby Bowden quote I talked about earlier. That what you allow, you encourage. And if you ever find yourself just allowing it and letting it slide, that's where it begins. And if you've been on the top and then you start letting things slide that you didn't let slide before, that's when the downfall starts happening. So you have to notice that. Your coaches, your assistants have to notice that, and you have to be intentional about not allowing that happen. Obviously, you're having your blueprint. We talked about the phases of the off season. Week 1 through 4, strength and conditioning, 5 through 8, film study, classroom stuff, 9 through 12, getting ready for 7-on-7s, and what are you doing in the summertime? Having those monthly or bi-weekly staff meetings where you're going over these kind of calendars, you're checking in on your kids, you're doing those things. It's a year-round thing. And always remember, simplicity over complexity. Fundamentals are everything. Culture drives consistency. That's why we're talking about leadership and culture. Data and evaluations matter. Give these kids results and you'll see improvement. And then if you coach that whole player, you're focused on football, academics, character, leadership, you will get so much more out of them. Because, it goes back to that thing, kids don't care until they know you care. And once they know you care, then they're all in on you. And so I think it's really, really important for you to understand this thing. Hopefully, if you're able to incorporate the things we talk about, the physical preparation, the skill development, the tactical execution, leadership, culture, staff excellence, management systems, and things like that, winning becomes a natural outcome, not just a hope. And that's where you want to be as you're working towards fall success. If you start to plan today and you plan thoroughly and you execute relentlessly and develop people before you chase wins, all that stuff will take care of itself. And I can remember when I was in college, hearing Coach Moore, because I played at Appalachian State. After I graduated, a couple years later, they won the first national championship, and then they won 3 in a row. And he kept talking about winning the first one was easy. He's like, getting good is easy, staying good is hard. And if you want to get good, work on culture, work on leadership. But if you want to stay good, you got to be intentional about enforcing those things and making that the biggest part. And if you want to be a championship coach, you have to master the off season of football. And hopefully these are some strategies and ideas that will help you build your program so that you can be the coach you want to be.